You should invest in Brazil. Or maybe not. Well, if you listen to some people, it's a great investment opportunity, while others think that you should avoid investing in Brazil completely, and if you have any money in Brazil, you should move it overseas straight away. So I thought I'd do a video and investigate what it's really like to make some investments in Brazil. So first of all, when I'm talking about investments, I'm talking about all types of investments, from savings, bonds, shares, and property. And I'm going to look into all of these in the video. So let's start off with the most basic, which is savings accounts. So in Brazil, the interest rates set by the central bank are pretty high. So at the moment, they are 15%, which is significantly higher than what they are in the US and Europe. And what that means is that interest rates on savings accounts are also higher. So at the moment, you can earn around 0.5% per month, which is 6% per year. So I mean, that's pretty good. But you can get much better rates if you go for something called a CDB, which is a certificate of deposit, which is a fixed income investment that you can do with the majority of banks here in Brazil. And these CDBs, they pay much higher rates. And when they talk about the interest rates for CDBs, they always talk about the CDI rate, which is the interbank interest rate that banks charge each other. And so a lot of CDBs say that they pay 100% CDI or 120% CDI. And the CDI rate at the moment is between 12 and 13% per year. And so CDBs that say they pay 100% of CDI, you'd get 12 to 13%. And then you have other CDBs that pay 120% of CDI. So then you get nearly 14% per year interest. But one thing to note is that you do have to pay tax on the interest income from CDBs. And the tax rate is between 15% and 22.5% on this interest income. But with savings accounts, you don't have to pay any tax on the interest income. But even with that difference, it usually still makes sense to go for a CDB rather than a savings account. And both the CDB and the savings account are covered by something called FGC, which is this guarantee that if a financial institution goes bankrupt, the first 250,000 reais that you have of that financial institution is protected. And 250,000 reais is $46,000. And then you also have other fixed income investments. One of them is Tesouro Direto, and so that is government bonds. And they also pay similar interest rates as CDBs. So you can see here you can get some fixed ones, which are around 13% per year. And I also have another investment called LCI and LCAs. And so these are fixed income investment products offered by banks. And the money you invest in these, the bank uses to invest in the agriculture and real estate sector. Now, at the moment, there's no tax on LCAs and LCIs, but next year there probably will be, as the government is planning to change that. So I mean, at first glance, these investments look great, right? You earn interest between 12 and 14% per year, which is significantly higher than what you can get in Europe and the States. Also, your money is protected by the FGC, so by the government, if an institution goes bankrupt. So I mean, it seems perfect, right? And yeah, it is pretty good. But there is a reason why interest rates are much higher in Brazil than they are in Europe and the States. I mean, first of all, interest rates are very high at the moment in Brazil, and probably in the near future, the central bank will start reducing them down a bit. But there are also two other risks investing in these products that I mentioned. One of them is currency risk. What I'm talking about here is the risk that the Brazilian currency, which is the Brazilian real, that this will devalue against the euro, the dollar, sterling, and so on. Because if we look at the exchange rate between the Brazilian real and the US dollar, you can see here it's fluctuated quite a lot. So if we look back at 2017, you can see the exchange rate was 3 Brazilian reals for $1 US. But now it's 5.4 Brazilian reals to $1, and a few months ago it was 6 Brazilian reals for $1. So that means that since 2017, the Brazilian real has devalued a lot against the US dollar. And so what that means is that, say that you, back in 2017, converted US dollars to Brazilian reals, transferred it to a Brazilian bank, and put it in one of these CDBs or something similar. Yes, you'd be getting significantly higher interest rates than you would in the US. However, you'd also be losing money because the Brazilian real would be devaluing. So this is a very important factor that you need to consider. And also another risk is inflation. So if you're a foreigner and you're planning to move to Brazil, then you're also going to be exposed to inflation risk. And that is that inflation here in Brazil is relatively high compared to Europe and the state. So inflation in Brazil is around 5%, which is the IPCA. There are some other measures as well. But also a few years ago here in Brazil, it was much higher as well. And so what that means is that the real interest income that you get, so you take the interest income, but then you take off the effect of inflation, and what you're left with isn't that great. So now, hopefully now you can kind of see why interest rates are higher in Brazil, because you have these risks of inflation and currency devaluation. And so investors demand a higher interest rate in order to compensate for these risks. Okay, so that's fixed income. Now let's have a look at stocks and shares. So in Brazil, you've got the Sao Paulo Stock Exchange, which is called B3. And the main stock index is Ibovespa. So if you look at the performance of that over the last 10 years, it's gone up by around 250%. And if we look at the main US index, the S&P 500, it's actually gone up slightly less at 219%. However, there are some big differences between the US stock market and the Brazilian stock market. So the Sao Paulo Stock Exchange has just over 400 companies in it. And if you compare that to the US stock exchanges, so the New York Stock Exchange has over 2,400 companies in it, and the NASDAQ has over 3,000 companies in it. And also in terms of size, if we just look at the New York Stock Exchange, so the value of the companies in that is over $30 trillion, while the value of the companies in the Sao Paulo stock market is around 700 billion. And so yeah, the Brazilian stock market is significantly smaller, but that doesn't mean there are some good Brazilian companies to invest in. So let's have a look at a couple. So if you speak to most Brazilian investors and ask them what companies they've invested in, most of them will probably mention Petrobras, which is a big Brazilian oil company, partly owned by the government, and Banco do Brasil, which is a big bank, again, partly owned by the government. And people are invested in these partly because they see them as less risk, because they're big, and they're partly controlled by the government, and then also because they pay relatively high dividends. So the dividend yield in Petrobras at the moment is 16%, and Banco do Brasil, it's 9%. So I mean, those are some high dividend yields compared to European and American companies. So I mean, you can see here, US oil companies, they pay dividends of between 3 and 5%. Banks pay between 2 and 3%, more or less. So again, you get much higher dividends from Brazilian companies. And another attractive thing about these investments is that you don't pay any income tax on the dividends. So at the moment, all dividends paid by Brazilian companies are tax-free. Now, there are some proposed changes, which is that if you earn over 50,000 reais in dividends from one company, then you have to pay a 10% income tax on it. And 50,000 reais is $9,000. So if you get more than $9,000 in dividends from one company, then you'd have to pay a tax. But if you get less than that, so you get a bit of dividends from this company, a bit of that, and so on, it seems like these dividends will still be tax-free. And then they're also discussing taxing dividends that go to foreigners as well. So if you're not living in Brazil and you're getting dividends from Brazilian companies, then you might have to pay tax on that. So these high dividend returns that you get from these investments, they're very similar to the savings accounts and the fixed income products that I mentioned earlier. But then you have the same risks as well, which include inflation risk and currency devaluation risk, and also the fact that if the Brazilian economy doesn't do great, then these companies may not be able to continue paying these high dividends. Now, I personally am not invested that much in Petrobras or Banco do Brasil. The companies that I have investments in are Embraer, which is a big aircraft manufacturer, also Nubank, which is a large bank but only online, and also TOTVS, which is a big Brazilian software company as well. And they pay much lower dividends, but I'm more focused on capital growth. And that's just a couple, but those three I really like. Okay, and then finally, another investment is property. And here you've got two options. Buy a house or an apartment or some land, or you can invest in real estate funds. So first of all, let's have a look at buying a house or an apartment. So one good thing about buying properties here in Brazil is that, in general, the property values are significantly lower than what they are in Europe or the US. So for someone who can't afford to buy a property in Europe or the US, might be able to buy one in Brazil because of the lower prices. And I've done videos showing you can buy a house or an apartment for $100,000 in many areas here in the south of Brazil. Obviously, if you want to live in the city center of the big cities, then you're going to struggle. But on the outskirts and the smaller cities, it's definitely possible. Another positive is that the rental market in Brazil is pretty big as well. And so if you buy a property, especially an apartment, in a good city, in a good location, then it's relatively easy to rent out on a long-term basis. And also if you buy a property near the beach or in a touristy town as well, then it's also relatively easy to rent out on Airbnb. And in terms of the return that you can get from renting out a property, so if you look at this report here from FIPI-ZAP, so they do monthly reports on rental prices and the returns. So here you can see that the rental yield is just under 6% per year for the whole of Brazil. But then looking down at the cities, you can see it fluctuates here from 8% in Recife down to 4.5% in Curitiba. And obviously this is just an average. These are big cities, so you've got some big variations within each city as well. But there's another graphic which shows you even better. So you can see the differences in rental returns by city. So apparently the city with the highest return is Santos in Sao Paulo, which is a city at the coast, and it's got a very big important port there. And then also Manaus, apparently, and the city in the Amazon rainforest, the rental returns are very high there. And then you can see the returns gradually go down, with the city with the lowest rental return being Vitória and Espírito Santo, which is just above Rio de Janeiro, near the coast. And then this is also pretty interesting, which shows the type of property that gives you the highest return, and that is properties with one bedroom. Now you always need to be careful relying on these figures, but I think it's interesting just to get a feel for the market. Another positive about buying property here in Brazil is that if you buy an apartment under construction, so off plan, then you're able to enter into an agreement with the construction company to pay them in installment. Because if you're a foreigner trying to buy a property in Brazil, it's going to be very difficult to get a mortgage with a Brazilian bank. But you are able to enter into this contract with the construction company and pay them in installments, a bit like a mortgage. But obviously you've got the risk of the construction company going bankrupt, so you obviously need to do your research carefully. But that is another positive. But there are some downsides to buying property in Brazil, and one of the problems is that the Brazilian property market is a bit slow. So say you buy a property for an investment, you rent it out for a few years, but then you decide you want to sell it. Well, in Brazil, that could take a few years in order to sell the property. Because in Sweden, it can take a few months to sell a property. But in the US and the UK, it can take longer. But still, usually it doesn't take years to sell. While here in Brazil, I know many people have tried to sell their homes for many, many years. I mean, a lot of people don't do themselves any favors by putting a very high price and not willing to negotiate. But even so, in general, it takes a long time to sell property, unless you're in some very desirable area. Another thing is the income tax. So you need to pay income tax up to 27.5% on the rental income. Now you are able to set up a company and the company receives the rental income and then you reduce your income tax a lot. But that is more work and more bureaucracy. But I would say if that you're planning to have a couple of investment properties, definitely worth it. And then also you've got the general economic risk as well, like I mentioned on the shares, in terms of risks with the tariffs and other economic and political uncertainty. But then there's another option to invest in real estate, and that's through a fund. And so in Brazil, these are called FII, Fundo Imobiliários. And these are very popular because it means you get exposure to the Brazilian property market without having to invest huge sums of money. And there's lots of funds out there investing in shopping malls, commercial real estate and warehouses and so on. And in terms of the dividends they pay, so that ranges from like 8% to 15%, depending on the fund and how much risk is involved. But then you also benefit from the capital growth as well, with the fund growing in value. Now, currently there's no tax on these dividends from FIIs, but the government is planning to change that. So next year you might have to pay tax on dividends, which would make these FIIs a bit less attractive. But still, it's an easy way of getting exposure to the property market. Okay, so those are some of the investments you can make here in Brazil. There are definitely some good investment opportunities, but I have to stress very strongly that you have to be very careful about these currency fluctuations before you start converting lots of money into Brazilian reais. But one simple way of mitigating the currency risk, if you're planning to move here to Brazil, is that you keep half your money in dollars, euros, sterling, and the other half in Brazilian reais. And so that acts as a simple hedge. I mean, it's not 100% perfect, but it will protect you to a big extent from currency fluctuations. So I hope you like this video. Please leave a like, subscribe. If you've got any questions or anything, leave in the commentary below. So thanks for watching. Until next time.